He had always dreamed of having his own place, property he could manage, improve, and eventually turn into something valuable. It wasn't about showing off or becoming rich quickly. It was about creating security, independence, and a sense of pride. After years of saving and careful planning, he finally found a property in a neighborhood that seemed perfect. The houses were neat, the streets were quiet, and people took care of their homes. Everything seemed ideal. But he soon learned that dreams rarely come without obstacles. The first time he met the tenant, he thought it would be straightforward. She seemed polite at first, a woman in her mid-40s who had lived in the house for years. She knew the ins and outs of the neighborhood and had a reputation for being very protective of her space. At first, he admired her dedication. However, it didn't take long to see that her protectiveness bordered on stubbornness. And stubbornness, he realized, could turn into a real challenge. When he explained his plans for minor renovations, the first signs of resistance appeared. He wasn't planning anything extreme, just small improvements that would maintain the property and keep it in good shape. But she reacted defensively, as if any change would be an invasion. She brought up rules from the Homeowners Association, local regulations, and even her own interpretations of the law. It became clear that getting her agreement would not be simple. He quickly understood that patience would be his most valuable tool. He listened to her complaints carefully, took notes, and responded calmly. He didn't want to start any arguments, because he knew that in situations like this, arguments could easily turn into a long, draining battle. Every time she raised a concern, he responded politely, explaining his reasoning and assuring her that nothing would disrupt her daily life. Still, she remained wary, and he knew that earning her trust or at least reducing her resistance would take time. While dealing with her, he also had to navigate the rules of the Homeowners Association. The HOA was strict, with clear guidelines about renovations, landscaping, and property appearances. Any violation could result in fines or legal complications. He spent hours studying the documents, learning what he could and could not do. He also talked to other residents, quietly gathering information about how previous disagreements had been resolved. He realized that knowledge would be his weapon, patience his shield. Days turned into weeks, and small interactions with the tenant began to feel like chess moves. Each conversation required careful thought. If he said too much, he risked giving her ammunition to fight against his plans. If he said too little, she might assume he was hiding something. He learned to strike a balance, being transparent enough to build credibility, but cautious enough to protect his position. He was learning more than just property management. He was learning human nature, the kind of lessons that money alone cannot buy. He also noticed how people around him reacted. Neighbors were friendly but observant. Some had been living there for decades, and they knew the tenant's reputation. She had a history of challenging newcomers, and had successfully resisted changes before. Hearing these stories made him more determined, but he also realized that he could not rely on gossip or secondhand information. He needed concrete evidence and a clear understanding of his legal rights. At night, he would often sit with documents spread across his table, going over contracts, legal papers, and HOA rules. He highlighted key points, cross-checked information, sometimes even made calls to legal advisors to ensure he was not missing anything. It was a slow process, and at times, it was exhausting. But he reminded himself why he was doing this. This wasn't just about property, it was about standing firm, learning how to navigate challenges, ultimately achieving something he could call his own. Despite the challenges, there were small victories. Sometimes she would accept a minor change or even admit that a suggestion made sense. Those moments, though rare, gave him hope. They reminded him that even the most resistant person could be reached with patience and strategy. He began to understand her motivations as well. She wasn't trying to be difficult for no reason. She genuinely cared about her home and how it was managed. Recognizing this human side helped him remain calm. Even when she tried to block his plans, he also started documenting everything carefully. Every conversation, every email, every informal chat became a record. He knew that in the future, if things escalated, having accurate documentation would be crucial. It wasn't about mistrusted, it was about protecting himself and ensuring that decisions were based on facts, not assumptions. This approach gave him a sense of control in a situation that often felt unpredictable. As weeks turned into months, he began to notice patterns. She would challenge plans more aggressively at first, but sometimes would gradually accept them after repeated explanations. Understanding these patterns allowed him to plan his moves more effectively. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was anticipating, preparing for potential conflicts before they happened. This shift from reaction to strategy marked a significant change in how he approached the entire situation. Despite the constant tension, he never lost sight of his goal. He wasn't trying to intimidate her or force his way. He wanted a fair, mutually beneficial arrangement where the property could thrive and she could feel secure in her home. This mindset kept him grounded and prevented the situation from turning into personal conflict. It was a lesson in professionalism, patience, and empathy all at once. He also made efforts to build a positive relationship outside of disagreements. Sometimes he would ask her opinion on small matters, showing respect for her experience and knowledge. He learned to celebrate small agreements, acknowledging when she cooperated, no matter how minor the change. These moments helped soften the atmosphere, making future negotiations slightly easier. He realized that human interactions were not just about rules and contracts, they were about trust, respect, and understanding. One day, a small victory occurred that lifted his spirits. He proposed a simple landscaping improvement, planting flowers along the front walkway. She initially resisted, citing HOA rules and personal preference. But after patiently explaining that it would beautify the property without violating any regulations, she agreed. It wasn't a major win, but it felt significant. It proved that persistence, combined with respect and knowledge, could make a difference. He also spent time learning from his own mistakes. There were moments when he underestimated her reaction, assumed she would agree easily, or didn't fully explain a decision. Each time, he had to step back, reassess, and adjust his approach. These experiences taught him humility and reinforced the importance of preparation. He learned that success wasn't just about strategy, it was about consistency, integrity, and patience. Evenings often brought reflection. He would think about how far he had come and how much he had learned. This property, this challenging tenant, and the strict HOA had become a classroom of life lessons. He learned about human behavior, negotiation, patience, and resilience. He realized that these lessons were more valuable than any financial gain. They would serve him well in future endeavors, both personal and professional. Throughout this time, he maintained a careful balance. He didn't let frustration dictate his actions, and he didn't let small victories make him complacent. Every decision, every conversation was measured and thoughtful. He became methodical, strategic, and highly aware of the dynamics around him. It was exhausting at times, but he knew that patience and careful planning would eventually pay off. By the end of this first stage, he had established a foundation. He had learned the tenants' habits, the HOA's rules, and the neighborhood's unwritten customs. He had begun to earn small concessions, build trust, and understand the subtle art of negotiation. More importantly, he had strengthened his own confidence. Realizing that he could navigate challenges that seemed overwhelming at first. This part of the journey wasn't about dramatic victories or clear-cut triumphs. It was about laying the groundwork, building relationships, understanding rules, and preparing for the next steps. It was about persistence, patience, and staying focused on long-term goals rather than immediate satisfaction. He knew that the real challenges were still ahead, but he also knew that he had the tools, knowledge, and mindset to face them. By the time the first few months passed, he had a sense of quiet accomplishment. The tenant still resisted changes occasionally, but the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was guiding, planning, and gradually influencing outcomes. He had learned to navigate a complex situation with patience and strategy, and each small victory reinforced his confidence. Even on difficult days, when her stubbornness seemed insurmountable, he reminded himself why he had started this journey. It wasn't about control or winning arguments. It was about creating a space he could manage responsibly, improving a property that mattered, and demonstrating that persistence and careful planning could overcome resistance. Each interaction, each challenge, was a step toward that goal. By the end of this stage, he understood the value of preparation, patience, and empathy. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he had developed the skills to navigate it. The foundation was set. The tenant's resistance was a challenge, not an obstacle. He had learned that success in situations like this required calm, careful strategy, and the ability to understand and respect the human element. This first part of the journey had prepared him for everything that was yet to come. After months of careful observation, learning the tenant's routines, and studying the HOA rules, he finally started to see an opening. The tenant had grown used to his calm presence and patience, and though she was still wary, he could feel that her resistance might soften if approached strategically. He knew that this was the moment when he could start making real progress, and he had to be careful. Any misstep could push her back into full opposition. He began spending more time understanding the neighborhood and its residents. Talking to neighbors quietly, he discovered the history of the property and the woman's long-term presence there. They spoke of her determination, her vigilance, and her unwillingness to compromise easily. While some warned him that she would never back down, others suggested that patience and consistency might eventually win her over. He absorbed every word, analyzing how he could turn information into action without being confrontational. One day, he found a critical piece of information while reviewing property documents. There was a minor inconsistency in how the previous ownership had been recorded, something overlooked in earlier transactions. It was not something illegal, but it was enough to give him a legal advantage if he approached it carefully. He realized this could be the turning point he had been waiting for. It was the kind of opportunity that required tact and timing. Rushing into it could create unnecessary conflict. Using it wisely could shift the balance in his favor. Before making any moves, he spent hours preparing a clear plan. He wrote down steps, possible reactions, and backup strategies. He consulted a legal advisor to ensure that every action would be protected and enforceable. Knowledge, he understood, was not enough. He needed to act within the boundaries of law and procedure to avoid giving her a reason to challenge him further. By being meticulous, he ensured that he had a strong foundation before any confrontation. Meanwhile, he continued to maintain a respectful relationship with the tenant. He knew that any open hostility could undermine his efforts. He listened patiently to her complaints, made minor adjustments when necessary, and never raised his voice. She noticed his consistency, and though she remained skeptical, she began to sense that he was not an adversary to fear, but someone who would stand his ground calmly. Small gestures of fairness, like responding promptly to her concerns or fixing issues that affected her comfort, began to build trust. He also started using small strategic moves to test boundaries. Simple requests for minor improvements were framed as collaborative efforts, showing her that any changes would be beneficial for everyone involved. Some of these requests were accepted, others met resistance. But each interaction provided him with more insight into her mindset and decision-making process. Every refusal and every acceptance was carefully noted, allowing him to refine his approach continually. As he moved forward, he became more adept at reading human behavior. He realized that much of her resistance came from fear of losing control or feeling disregarded. By framing proposals in ways that respected her concerns while still advancing his objectives, he could gently guide outcomes without triggering defensive reactions. This psychological understanding became as important as any legal knowledge or procedural preparation he had. There were also moments of tension that tested his patience. She would sometimes exaggerate minor issues, sending long lists of complaints or citing obscure rules to block changes. On those days, he reminded himself of his long-term goal. He didn't react emotionally. Instead, he reviewed the situation calmly, analyzed the legitimacy of her claims, and prepared reasoned responses. Over time, she began to recognize that his responses were fair and consistent. Even when she disagreed, one afternoon, he proposed a minor repair to the front porch. Something that seemed insignificant, but would enhance safety and the property's appearance. At first, she resisted, pointing to HOA rules and past practices. Instead of arguing, he provided evidence showing that the repair complied with regulations and would benefit both of them. After some discussion, she reluctantly agreed. It was a small victory, but it demonstrated that patient explanation and factual support could change her mind without confrontation. Meanwhile, he noticed that her confidence in blocking changes was not as strong as it appeared. Conversations with neighbors revealed that she had successfully resisted changes in the past, but often through persistence rather than legal authority. This insight gave him hope. He understood that persistence, patience, and proper documentation could eventually outweigh her assertiveness. Each interaction became an opportunity to test this theory. He also worked on strengthening his legal and administrative position quietly. Paying attention to every notice, reviewing all HOA correspondence, maintaining records of every interaction gave him a sense of control. He felt prepared for any challenge, knowing that his actions were supported by both law and careful documentation. This preparation was empowering and helped him approach even the most resistant responses with confidence rather than frustration. As weeks passed, he began introducing small improvements that were beneficial to both the tenant and the neighborhood. Simple things like trimming hedges, fixing leaks, and repainting the exterior were framed as collaborative efforts. Each improvement was communicated clearly, highlighting benefits and ensuring she understood the purpose. These small wins built a subtle momentum. She could not ignore the positive changes, and they slowly softened her resistance. He also learned the importance of timing. Proposing changes when she was already frustrated or stressed could backfire, while presenting them during calm periods increased the likelihood of acceptance. He adjusted his approach, paying close attention to moods, routines, and external factors that might influence her responses. This sensitivity to human emotion, combined with factual preparation, became one of his strongest tools. Gradually, he began to see a shift in the dynamic. She no longer reacted as aggressively to minor changes. Her objections became more measured, and she started asking questions instead of outright denying proposals. He realized that his strategy of patience, careful explanation, and factual evidence was working. This did not mean the battle was over, but it meant that he could begin planning for larger steps that would ultimately give him control. One of the critical lessons he learned was the value of empathy. Understanding her perspective, her fear of losing control, her attachment to the property, and her desire to protect her home, allowed him to tailor his approach. He did not see her as an enemy. He saw her as a person with valid concerns. By acknowledging those concerns, while calmly guiding decisions, he could reduce resistance and create a cooperative environment, even if it was a reluctant cooperation at first. At the same time, he began preparing for a more significant strategic move. The minor inconsistency in property documentation that he had discovered earlier became the focal point. He carefully gathered supporting evidence, cross-checked records, and planned how to present this information if the need arose. This preparation was meticulous. Every detail mattered. He wanted to ensure that when the moment came, he could act decisively and confidently. Without leaving room for challenge or misunderstanding, he also understood that timing and patience were crucial. Acting too early could alert her to his intentions, while waiting too long could prolong the struggle unnecessarily. He watched her reactions closely, gauging when she was most vulnerable to persuasion or least likely to resist. This awareness of human behavior, combined with his careful planning, made him feel in control of the situation even before the decisive steps were taken. During this period, he maintained a balanced life outside of property matters. He spent time with friends, pursued personal interests, and ensured that the stress of the situation did not consume him. This balance was essential. It helped him approach each interaction with clarity and calm, preventing frustration or impatience from undermining his strategy. He realized that long-term challenges required not just planning and strategy, but emotional resilience as well. As the weeks turned into months, saw tangible results. Minor improvements were accepted, trust was slowly building, and the tenant's resistance was less rigid than before. Each small success reinforced his confidence and provided valuable lessons for future actions. He documented every outcome, analyzed patterns, and adjusted his strategy accordingly. The process was slow, but it was effective. By the end of this stage, he had transformed the dynamic entirely. He was no longer just a patient observer. He was an active strategist, shaping outcomes subtly but effectively. The tenant still had influence, but she was no longer the dominating force she once appeared to be. The first seeds of control had been planted, and he was prepared to nurture them carefully for the changes ahead. This part of the journey highlighted the power of preparation, patience, and understanding human behavior. It was not about confrontation or aggression, but about strategy, empathy, and persistence. Every action, every conversation, and every observation had brought him closer to his ultimate goal. He had learned that success in challenging situations required more than legal knowledge or planning. It required insight into human nature, emotional intelligence, and unwavering patience. He now stood on the brink of a turning point. The minor victories, the careful preparations, and the understanding he had gained would soon allow him to take more decisive steps. The tenant's defenses had weakened subtly. Her confidence in opposition was shaken, and he was ready to move forward. What had started as a struggle was transforming into an opportunity, a chance to achieve his goal while maintaining integrity and fairness. The stage was set, and the next chapter promised to be the most critical yet. He could feel the shift in the air. The tenant's usual sharp resistance had softened just enough for him to start making more meaningful moves. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to him. It meant that his patience and careful planning were beginning to bear fruit. The property had always been more than just a building. It was a symbol of his determination. And now he could finally start shaping it in a way that reflected his vision. He began taking actions that were both strategic and practical. Small repairs, like fixing a broken gate, repainting fences, and replacing worn-out fixtures, were done quietly but deliberately. Each improvement was carefully communicated to the tenant as a benefit to her comfort and security. He avoided using authoritative language, choosing instead words that suggested collaboration and mutual advantage. By framing every action as a shared goal, he kept her from feeling cornered, which was key to reducing her resistance. During this time, he also paid attention to her patterns and habits. He noticed when she was more open to discussion, when she seemed distracted, and even when she was likely to argue unnecessarily. He began to time his interactions to coincide with her calmer moments, presenting proposals when she was most likely to listen and consider them thoughtfully. This attention to timing was as important as the actions themselves. Allowing him to navigate a tricky social dynamic without causing conflict, he also realized that small victories mattered just as much as big ones. Each time she agreed to a minor repair or improvement, it strengthened the momentum. He made a conscious effort to acknowledge these moments without overemphasizing them, allowing her to feel like she had some control. It was a delicate balance. He had to progress without making her feel manipulated. Every interaction became a lesson in human behavior and negotiation. Meanwhile, he quietly strengthened his legal position. He gathered all documents related to the property, cross-checked ownership records, and maintained meticulous notes of every conversation and correspondence. This wasn't about mistrust. It was about ensuring that, if a dispute escalated, he would have a solid foundation. The careful documentation gave him confidence. It reminded him that strategy and preparation were just as important as patience and diplomacy. He also started thinking about the long-term potential of the property. Beyond the immediate struggle with the tenant, he wanted to make improvements that would increase its value and appeal. Landscaping, minor renovations, and modernizations were all planned in stages, each carefully timed to avoid triggering resistance. He knew that every improvement, no matter how small, brought him closer to a position of authority and control. During this period, he also focused on building rapport. He would occasionally ask her opinion on small decisions, showing respect for her experience and knowledge. This approach allowed her to feel included without gaining leverage over him. Over time, these small gestures of respect and inclusion softened her demeanor. She remained cautious, but she started to view him less as a threat and more as someone who was capable and reasonable. Despite these advancements, challenges remained. She would occasionally challenge his actions, citing obscure rules or past precedents to block changes. On these days, he reminded himself to stay calm. Instead of arguing, he gathered evidence, presented facts clearly, showed how his proposals were both fair and compliant. His ability to respond without frustration began to shift the dynamic further. She realized that resistance alone would not be enough to control outcomes. One significant breakthrough came when he proposed an exterior improvement that would enhance safety and aesthetics. She initially resisted, as expected. But he presented clear evidence that the change complied with regulations and improved the property for everyone. After a series of calm discussions, she finally agreed. It was a moment of quiet triumph. It proved that patience, preparation, and respectful communication could overcome stubborn opposition. The victory wasn't dramatic, but it was meaningful and strategic. He also began to see the impact of consistency. By handling every interaction with care, fairness, and calm, he built credibility. She started to notice that his intentions were genuine, and that he was not simply trying to push her out or take control forcefully. Each consistent action reinforced the perception that he was trustworthy and competent. The subtle change in her perception became a critical advantage, in addition to property improvements. He started thinking more broadly about strategy. The minor inconsistencies in the ownership documentation he had discovered earlier were now more important than ever. He began preparing a careful plan to use them if necessary, ensuring that he could assert his rights fully when the moment arrived. Every action, from minor repairs to documentation review, was aligned with this larger goal, creating a cohesive, long-term strategy. He also remained mindful of his emotional state. Managing a resistant tenant required patience and emotional control. He made sure to step away when needed, engage in personal interests, and maintain balance in his life. This balance was crucial for thinking clearly and making decisions that were strategic rather than reactionary. Emotional control became as important a tool as any legal or practical measure he employed. Over time, he began to notice small changes in her behavior. She questioned less, seemed more willing to listen, and even made occasional suggestions that aligned with his improvements. It was subtle, but it confirmed that his approach was working. The resistance that had seemed so unyielding was beginning to soften, not because she had given in completely, but because she realized that his approach was consistent, fair, and thoughtful. He continued to document every interaction meticulously. Knowing that these records would be valuable in the future, every agreement, every refusal, and every minor concession was logged. This attention to detail ensured that he had a clear understanding of the evolving dynamic and could plan his next moves with precision. It also provided reassurance that any disputes could be resolved based on evidence rather than perception. By carefully balancing assertiveness with empathy, he managed to gradually shift the power dynamic. She remained a presence of influence, but her ability to block changes diminished. Small, well-timed actions accumulated into a pattern of progress. He realized that patience, strategic thinking, and understanding human behavior were far more powerful than confrontation or aggression. He also used this period to plan more significant improvements, ones that would increase the property's value and his influence. Every step was calculated to avoid unnecessary conflict while still advancing his goals. Timing, communication, and preparation were key. He knew that success depended not just on actions, but on the perception of fairness and reasonableness. One afternoon, completed a series of minor renovations that had been planned for weeks. She observed the changes initially skeptical, but eventually recognized their benefits. The improvements were functional, enhanced safety, and were aesthetically pleasing. This moment marked a turning point in their relationship. She began to see that his actions were not arbitrary or self-serving, but carefully considered and beneficial for the property and neighborhood as he progressed. He also became more confident in his ability to navigate challenges. He had learned to anticipate objections, prepare responses, and present proposals in ways that reduced resistance. Every interaction became an opportunity to test assumptions and refine his approach. This skill extended beyond property management. It was a lesson in patience, strategy, human psychology that would serve him in many areas of life. The stage was now set for more decisive actions. The tenant's confidence in blocking changes had weakened subtly. Her perception of him as reasonable and competent had grown, and he was ready to leverage these shifts. The minor victories had built momentum, and the careful groundwork had prepared him for the next phase. By the end of this stage, it transformed the struggle into a manageable challenge. He was no longer simply reacting to her resistance. He was shaping outcomes, guiding decisions, and subtly asserting influence. The combination of preparation, patience, empathy, and strategic action had shifted the dynamic in his favor. The tenant remained present, but her ability to resist effectively had been diminished. This stage of the journey reinforced key lessons: persistence, careful observation, and understanding human behavior were as important as legal knowledge or procedural expertise. Every small action, every thoughtful conversation, and every documented interaction contributed to a larger strategy that was gradually unfolding. He had learned that lasting influence required more than force. It required intelligence, patience, and empathy. As he looked ahead, he realized that the next steps would be critical. The groundwork was laid, the tenant's resistance had softened, and he had developed the skills and insight needed to take more decisive actions. What had once seemed like an impossible challenge was now a manageable, strategic process. The journey had been long and sometimes exhausting, but it had prepared him. For the pivotal moves that would define the outcome, the tension in the neighborhood had grown quietly, almost imperceptibly, as he began to take more decisive steps. He had spent months preparing, observing, and acting strategically, and now he was ready to move forward in ways that would change the balance of power. The tenant who had resisted every minor improvement could no longer block the changes as she once did. She was cautious but unaware of the full extent of the preparations he had made. He began implementing more substantial changes, starting with repairs and enhancements that improved safety, comfort, and appearance. Each project was carefully planned and communicated in a way that emphasized mutual benefit. He avoided confrontation, instead framing his actions as practical and necessary, not as an assertion of authority. She could not deny the value of the changes, yet her pride and past habits made it hard for her to fully accept them. Meanwhile, he prepared to address the inconsistencies in the property documentation that he had discovered earlier. This was the critical leverage point he had been waiting for. He had collected every relevant paper, checked every legal clause, and consulted advisors to ensure that every step would be supported. It was a move that required precision and calm, and he knew it could shift the power dynamic definitively in his favor. The first challenge came when she attempted to block a minor renovation, citing old HOA rules that no longer applied. She presented her argument confidently, believing that she could maintain control. Instead of reacting with anger, he calmly presented the facts, showing that the rules she cited had changed and that the renovation complied with current regulations. His preparation and calm demeanor left her with no valid objection, and she had to step back. It was a subtle victory, but one that reinforced his growing authority. Over the following weeks, he continued to implement changes, each more significant than the last. He repaired structural issues that had been neglected for years, improved landscaping, and updated fixtures throughout the property. Each improvement was framed as a way to protect the property and increase its value, not as a personal gain. She watched silently, unable to argue against the tangible benefits. The subtle shift in control was becoming more visible, not only to him, but also to neighbors who had observed their interactions. He also began engaging in direct conversations about the property's management. He presented clear, logical arguments for each improvement, referencing regulations, safety standards, and practical benefits. His approach was firm yet respectful, allowing him to assert authority without confrontation. The tenant realized that her usual tactics, arguing, blocking, or delaying, were no longer effective. She had underestimated his preparation and patience. During this stage, he also paid attention to psychological strategies. He allowed her to feel included in decision-making, while subtly guiding outcomes. By asking for her opinion on minor details, he created the illusion of control, even as he made the larger decisions. This approach softened her resistance and allowed him to advance his objectives without creating open conflict. One afternoon, he introduced a larger renovation plan, one that involved updating key areas of the property for safety and aesthetic appeal. She initially resisted, as expected, citing rules, past precedents, and personal preference. But he presented clear, undeniable evidence of the benefits, including cost-effectiveness, compliance with regulations, and improvement of her living conditions. The discussion was calm, measured, and factual. Gradually, she realized that opposition was futile. She reluctantly allowed the plan to proceed. With each concession, he noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. The once defiant attitude softened, replaced by cautious acceptance. She still had influence, but her confidence in obstructing changes was weakened. He had reached a point where he could implement improvements that were impossible a few months earlier. His combination of patience, strategic thinking, and careful communication had transformed the dynamic entirely. He also focused on communication with neighbors and other community members. By maintaining a reputation for fairness, responsibility, and diligence, he strengthened his position indirectly. Neighbors began to see him as someone capable and reliable, further isolating the tenant from her usual support network. These subtle social dynamics reinforced his control without confrontation, highlighting the importance of reputation and perception in complex situations in preparation for the final steps. He reviewed all property documentation once more. The minor inconsistencies that he had previously identified were now critical tools. He ensured that every detail was correct, every record was in place, and every potential challenge had been considered. This meticulous preparation gave him confidence. He knew that when the decisive moment arrived, he could act with authority and clarity, leaving no room for dispute. The tenant, sensing the change, but unsure of its extent, tried to assert influence through subtle objections and reminders of old practices. But each attempt was met with calm, factual responses, reinforcing his position without causing conflict. He had learned that patience, preparation, and respect for human nature were more effective than force or aggression. Her resistance had weakened, and she was beginning to recognize that his authority was grounded in logic, fairness, and persistence. One significant confrontation occurred when she tried to block a planned safety upgrade. She cited outdated regulations and personal preference, expecting to delay the project. Instead, he calmly presented documentation showing compliance with current rules and explained the practical benefits in a clear, respectful manner. She could not counter the evidence and had no choice but to accept the plan. It was a turning point, demonstrating that his preparation and calm approach could overcome even determined opposition as the property improvements progressed. He noticed the tenant's attitude shifting further. She began to offer suggestions that aligned with his plans, albeit cautiously. While she still retained pride in her knowledge of the property, she had begun to accept that his expertise and preparation were genuine and beneficial. This subtle cooperation marked a critical phase. He had moved from being a passive manager to an active leader. Guiding changes while maintaining respect for her perspective, he also ensured that all improvements were clearly documented. Before and after photos, records of expenses, and detailed notes of approvals and agreements were maintained meticulously. This documentation was not just practical. It reinforced his credibility and demonstrated a pattern of responsible management. It also provided a safeguard against any future challenges, ensuring that he could defend his decisions if necessary. Through careful strategy and incremental victories, he had shifted the balance of power without creating a direct confrontation. The tenant's influence had diminished, and her confidence in obstructing progress had weakened. He had achieved this through a combination of patience, strategic action, empathy, and meticulous preparation. The property was now under his growing control. The path to full authority was clear. As he prepared for the final phase, he reflected on the lessons learned. Patience, observation, strategic communication, and respect for human behavior had been more powerful than confrontation or force. Every small step, every careful action, and every thoughtful interaction had contributed to a larger plan that was now coming to fruition. He realized that true authority was not about dominance, but about preparation, strategy, and empathy. By the end of this stage, he had reached a point where the tenant could no longer effectively resist changes. She was still present, still cautious, but her ability to influence outcomes had been substantially reduced. The property was improving, his authority was growing, and he was ready to take the decisive steps that would finally establish full control. The stage was set for the climax, the moment when months of preparation, patience, and strategy would pay off. This stage of the journey demonstrated the power of calm, thoughtful action in the face of resistance. It highlighted the importance of preparation, observation, empathy, and strategic communication. He had moved from cautious patience to active influence, shaping the property and the situation in ways that were both effective and respectful. The next steps promised to solidify his authority and complete the transformation that had begun months earlier. By the time he reached the final stage of his journey with the property, the dynamics had shifted dramatically. What had started as a tense struggle had transformed into a carefully managed situation where he held most of the cards. The tenant, who had once resisted every minor change, was now cautious and more reserved. She still occupied the property, but the control and direction had subtly yet unmistakably moved into his hands. He began the final phase by consolidating all the improvements and strategies he had implemented. Every repair, renovation, and update was carefully reviewed to ensure it met the highest standards. This attention to detail was not just about aesthetics or value. It was about demonstrating competence and establishing authority. The property reflected his planning and vision, making it clear to everyone involved that he was now the guiding force behind its management. Communication with the tenant remained a critical focus. He maintained calm, respectful dialogue, listening to any concerns she raised and addressing them factually and patiently. Her resistance was now more about pride and habit than actual objection, and he handled each instance with care. By allowing her to feel heard while subtly steering decisions, he created a balance where she could accept his authority without open conflict. One of the pivotal moments occurred when he addressed a lingering legal technicality that had been a minor point of contention. Using the careful documentation he had maintained, he presented the facts and clarified ownership rights. He did so in a way that was professional and respectful, avoiding any personal confrontation. The tenant realized that her attempts to challenge him were now baseless, and she had to accept the new reality. This moment marked the turning point where authority fully shifted. He then focused on enhancing the property further. Major improvements were implemented, including updates to the infrastructure, landscaping, and key interior areas. Each change was framed as a benefit for both the tenant and the long-term value of the property. She observed these improvements, acknowledging their practical advantages, though she did so reluctantly. The subtle shift in her behavior reflected her recognition that he was now in control. During this time, he also strengthened relationships with neighbors and the broader community by consistently demonstrating fairness, responsibility, and transparency. He built credibility that reinforced his authority indirectly. Neighbors who had previously been on the fence now recognized his competence and reliability. The tenant, aware of this support, understood that her traditional influence had diminished. Further cementing his position, he continued to use psychological insight and empathy in every interaction. By allowing her to make minor decisions and feel included in small ways, he maintained a sense of respect for her autonomy while guiding major outcomes. This approach prevented unnecessary conflict and allowed him to implement significant changes with minimal resistance. It was a delicate balance, but one that showcased his understanding of human behavior and strategic thinking.